Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this last installment of NCF Unbound of the fall semester. We are very excited to have this array of speakers to keep you focused today on this Friday afternoon / evening or whatever time it is, wherever you are. I wanted to just thank my co-organizers, Masha Belenky and Susan McCready, instrumental to getting this thing to happen every couple of months or so. And we're so grateful for you to keep grateful for you that you keep showing up and being engaged with this Zoom book series. So, Jennifer Yee is Professor of Literature in French and currently Deputy Chair of the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages at the University of Oxford, as well as a Tutorial Fellow of Christ Church. She's published 3 monographs, one on clichés of women in French colonial literature, one on exotic dialogism in 19th century French fiction, and most recently, the colonial comedy, Imperialism in the French Realist Novel. Her previous co-editing work includes an earlier volume on France and Indochina, in quotes, cultural representations, and a special issue of French studies on a post-colonial 19th century. She has published articles on subjects including colonialism, exoticism, postcards, Flaubert, Zola, Balzac, and Baudelaire. And Dr. Julia Hartley is currently based at King's College London, my grammar was wrong. Okay, she is currently based at King's College London, and from January 2023 will be lecturer in comparative literature at the University of Glasgow. With joint expertise in French, Italian, and Persian literature, her work focuses on transcultural exchange, the global circulation of literature, and the comparative analysis of cultural constructions of authority. She is the author of Reading Dante and Proust by Analogy from 2019, and Iran and French Orientalism, Persia and the Literary Culture of 19th Century France, which is forthcoming in 2023. Julia is also a BBC New Generation thinker and regularly presents her research on BBC Radio 3. And finally, Dr. Faye Wanrug Suwanwattana is lecturer in French studies at the Faculty of Liberal Arts. I should have asked her some more pronunciation guidance, but Thammasat University, Bangkok, Thailand. Really extending our global reach here today. She completed her DPhil at the University of Oxford, Merton. Her research interest includes colonial and post-colonial issues, cultural studies, gender studies, visual culture, and relationships between the global South and North. She's currently preparing a monograph entitled Colonial Decadence, Indochina and Fin de siècle French Literature, as well as working on a new project concerning the writings of French and Francophone women in Southeast Asia in the 20th century. And the volume that they've edited together, of course, is French Decadence in a Global Context, Colonialism and Exoticism, just hot off the presses, September 2022. We have a really great discount code for you, so maybe it's already in the chat, but it will be eventually if not. And they will be in discussion today with Professor of French at Montclair State University, Elizabeth Emery, who is the author of books, articles, and essay anthologies related to the reception of medieval art and architecture in 19th century France and America, to the links between early photography and journalism and the creation of the French Writer House museums, and to the work of women collectors. Her most recent book, published with Bloomsbury Visual Arts in 2022 and just out in paperback, is entitled Reframing Japonisme, Women and the Asian Art Market in 19th Century France, 1853 to 1914. As invited scholar at the French Institut National de l'Histoire de l'Art, she's been contributing to the, quote, Collectors and Asian Art Dealers in France from 1700 to 1939 program, a biobibliographical database that went live this fall. Check it out, and I will add that link into the chat while you guys are chatting. So I'm going to turn it over to you all now, and if everyone else can just turn off their cameras, and we'll invite you to turn your cameras back on at the end. Okay.
I'm just sharing my screen so that you can see the lovely cover and the title, the contents page, so that you can all see quite how many contributors there were and how exciting they are. But before I start talking, I'm going to say a few general things, and then Julia and Faye will talk later on. But I just want to say another big thank you to Rachel, Masha, and Susan for inviting us and organizing this, and to Elizabeth for having agreed to have a conversation with us. That's really great, and it's a pleasure for all three of us to be here. So it's lovely to have welcomed us in this way. So I don't know if I should leave the image up. Does everyone want me to leave it up, or shall I take it down for a bit? Leave it up for the moment.
For the first few minutes, everyone has time to process it.
Okay. While I'm blathering on, so this just a few general things. This project came initially out of a conference that was held in Oxford in 2018, and we asked for a few extra chapters and selected and formed it, with that as a kernel. But in fact, it has a much longer gestation period, because when I was working on my own thesis many decades ago, well, quite a long time ago, I was working on colonial literature, and I kept being startled by how much there was that was referring to decadence, particularly in relation to Indochina. And that's something that we see in the volume in the chapters by Wanrug and by Vladimir Kapur, that the role of Indochina in this theme of decadence. So I didn't have time in my own thesis to build on that. And it was a long time later, when I was supervising Wanrug's thesis, that I was able to vicariously live out the frustration of not having been able to do it at the time in my own. So I think there's this really interesting connection between decadence and colonialism that's been underexploited. And it's not just a coincidence of time. The time is very important. You think that the major period of French colonialism in the modern period, it corresponds exactly with the rise of decadence in that fin de siècle period. So, it's quite odd that people haven't thought about these two things together. But there are very good reasons why they haven't, mainly because decadence declares itself not being political, is the big thing about decadence. So I guess then you might be asking yourselves all sorts of questions. To start with, what on earth is decadence, and what's it got to do with colonialism? How do those two things fit together? And those would be very good questions. Don't ask me too much about what decadence is, because I could go on for far too long. But the main thing to know is, of course, that it's an insult, first of all. It's something about an anxiety that a culture has about itself, or an accusation that you launch against someone else's culture. And I think that's one of the ways in which it speaks very much to our own times, to France's anxieties now. We see that in a chapter by Jenai Engelhardt Humphreys, on Huisman in relation to, as he's taken up by Welbeck in the novel Soumission. So this idea of decadence is actually very, very much flavour of the decade, I guess. It seems to speak to us enormously now. So what's it got to do with colonialism in this fin de siècle period? It has quite a fraught relationship with colonialism. There are three major different ways, to put it in a nice, neat French three-part way. One is decadence is something that is aggravated by colonialism, because if you go out there and frequent all those nasty brown and black people, you're going to come back, more decadent. And hybridization, the fact of mixing cultures, mixing races, heaven forfend, is something that is going to provoke decadence and increase the decline of nations and the world. The second position is the opposite, that by going out as a Frenchman and colonizing all these different countries, you are actually reasserting and reinvigorating this declining national virility. So the colonies are l'école de la virilité, where you come back a real man. So reasserting, sort of combating decadence. And so you've got the sort of the pro and the anti. And then the third position, which really struck me, particularly in Indo-Chinese writing, is a kind of embrace of decadence, which never says so explicitly, but that sort of relishing of decadent tropes of androgyny, opium, toying with different religions, spirituality that's not the spirituality of Christianity, and a sort of decadent playing with different cultures, and a very lush prose style or verse style. So those three positions, I think, are very much present in the literature that we're all working on, and sometimes they're present simultaneously in ways that aren't really very clear cut. So that ambiguous nature of that ambivalence towards decadence. Are you for it? Are you against it? Sometimes denouncing it looks a bit like lingering over it and enjoying it. Sometimes those two things are happening at the same time, which is certainly true of the great texts of French decadence, like Rebours. On the surface, it's enjoying decadence, but it's also pretending to condemn it. So you're never quite sure which one dominates. So this anti-colonialism is present in the writing that draws on decadence, in particular in the writings of some of the anarchist writers, so Georges Darien and Octave Mirbeau, who are studied in the really interesting chapters by Richard Hibbert and Aurélien Laurigue. And as a little parenthesis, the work on Aurélien Laurigue's chapter that I did, I translated the quotes from Georges Darien, which has got to be the most challenging and therefore the most enjoyable translation experience I've ever had. So I really advise Georges Darien, brilliant anarchist writer, very challenging indeed. So that anti-colonialism is present, but there's also very much the opposite as well. And the anxieties about decadence in mainland France come across in chapters, for example, by Hélène Marquier, who writes about dance and the world of dance, and this anxiety about French classical dance and the ballet being corrupted by foreign elements. So those anxieties about colonialism and the colonial contacts are very much present as well. And the final part of my introduction, because I cover all those things, but I wanted to bring in also the second part of our subheading, which is exoticism. Exoticism is quite a fluid sort of term about which, again, don't ask me because I could go on for far too long. So I focused more specifically on Orientalism and something that I'm calling Orientalist ornamentalism, because that's so important in decadence. You can kind of see that in the cover, that ornamentalism is so fundamental. So that has a whole sort of slightly different relationship to decadence from the more directly colonial relationship, because particularly the arts of Islam are being drawn on as fueling decadence. So, and that ornamentalism is something that's drawn on in a chapter by Sam Bootle, which actually focuses specifically on an ornament, and not an Islamic ornament, it's a Buddhist ornament, but there's a very interesting relationship there as well. So those are my general points, and I will let Elizabeth ask questions of the other two.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And when you do read the book, you'll find that Jenny has produced this beautiful synthesis with history of the terms and englobing all of the other 9 contributions to the volume. So before I get there, just first, thanks again to Rachel, Susan, and Masha for creating this event, for inviting me to participate today, and especially to the book's editors and contributors for bringing global decadence to bear on 19th century France. I think we're seeing it more and more in the British context. And there's a very unique flavor in France, as Jenny has introduced. It really opens up, reading them across the volume, opens up all kinds of questions about decadence and colonialism, as we've just heard, but gender, religion, spirituality, genre, geography. And I hope that in the conversation that we'll have in a few minutes with Julia, Faye, and Jenny, you'll get a flavor for this that will set you up for reading the book itself. And one of the things I particularly enjoyed in reading it was to discover some writers I didn't know much about. So, people like that you hear about, but maybe haven't read their text, Myriam Ari or Claude Farrer, Jules Clarecy in a fictional context, Paul Bontemps, Jules Boissière, we heard about Georges Darien, Marius Sarri Leblanc, and then also looking at more canonical decadent works like À Rebours, Madame Chrysanthème, or Le Jardin des Supplices from very different perspectives than we're used to doing. So, thank you so much for bringing this book forward so that we have all of these fantastic new angles for research. And as I encourage you to read them across the book, but also the individual essays will be fantastic contributions to classes. The bibliography, in addition, is just a treasure. So, again, thank you so much for this rich, engaging, exciting book. For those of you who may be joining late, I think it's the very first NCFS Unbound in which we're talking about an edited volume anthology rather than a single authored book. So we're doing things a little bit different. With Faye and Julia, we have our 3 co-editors here who will answer some questions. Several of the contributors are also in the audience. And so at the very end, feel free as audience members to tap type questions into the chat, and we'll invite some of the contributors to pipe up and answer if they'd like to talk about their pieces at the very end. So as we sort of talk about the start, Jenny has shown this beautiful cover, and I might take that as an invitation to begin. We have this white hand with the gems and the ornaments, and it's a kind of a sexy cover. And that asks the Salome question, right? And that Salome is the figure of decadent texts in a European context. And so in a lot of these texts that we know, women are objectified, which is really not the case in this volume. So I was really quite struck by the fact that there's a good deal of emphasis placed on texts by women. We have Judith Gauthier, Myriam Hari, Jane Dieulafoy, and they use decadent motifs sometimes to address power structures, all kinds of different ways that we're seeing decadence from a different framework. And Julia's essay talks about Jane Dieulafoy's novel Parysatis, about a woman ruler from ancient Persia. So I wonder if Julia, you might talk a little bit more about sort of the cover, the title, the ways in which the volume engages with issues of women, of gender in general, gender fluidity, Orientalism, colonialism. Very broad, but.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think your starting point is just right. We do have a sense of how the Orient is feminized, and the colonial implications of that, presenting it as a terrain for the male hero to conquer and dominate. And that is actually a trope that does come up in Jane Dieulafoy. I got some post-its here to actually read the passages. But I'll start here sort of counterintuitively, where we have Dieulafoy writing of the ruins of ancient Susa that they're excavating. L'année dernière, malgré 3 mois de pénible effort, nous ne parvînmes pas à déchirer les voiles des grandes entrées du palais. Aujourd'hui, une baie s'abandonne sans fausse honte ni coquetterie. Les vieux édifices auraient-ils une âme de femme? And what fascinates me here is we have Dieulafoy, who over time they lived, we had the pronoun she, but as Rachel Mesch has shown in her book Before Trans, there is also a case to use the pronoun they when talking about Dieulafoy because of their gender nonconformity. And in this particular passage, Dieulafoy very much presenting themselves as a he. We, the men, are ripping the veils, are uncovering, are penetrating the Orient and revealing its secrets. And so you have this trope very much associated with male writers that is being redeployed to present the speaker as male. Whereas in the novel Parysatis, the picture is so different because Dieulafoy has a preface in which they use feminine adjectives, plus audacieuse que les auteurs classiques. And there's this whole boys versus girls dynamic where actually the Persian queen is the smartest, the best ruler, and the men are clueless. And on the one hand, as Jenny was saying, we have this condemnation of decadence of the Persian royal court, too many feasts, too many concubines, so decadent. But then with the detailed descriptions, we are kind of enjoying it. And yet, perhaps the least decadent is the character who we'd expect to be, because Parysatis is a woman. She has people killed. So we have that whole Salome tradition of a violent femme fatale. But Parysatis only kills when it's politically motivated. And it's very cool-headed, very strategic. These are not, random acts. And so at the same time, it is therefore questioning that cliché of a femme fatale. And another dimension I'd like to bring out, and this is in Valéry's chapter on Judith Gauthier, is how I think women authors are particularly interesting when it comes to intertextuality and how they engage with local cultures. And it's something I've also found in my own research on receptions of Persian literature. So Valéry in her chapter has this beautiful sentence where she says, the power of the Indian intertext in its turn colonizes France, unpicking the colonial illusion and overturning the dream of French assimilation. So the power of engaging with another cultural source and what that textual dialogue does. And I think women authors tend to be more interested in these experiments because, and again, this is not new. I know a lot of great 19th century scholars like Bénédicte Monica and Margot Vine have talked about this, because of Western women dealing with the Orient. They're in a position of power, of authority by virtue of being from the colonizing nation, and yet they're women, they're hierarchically below men. And so they're much more keen, I think, to experiment both with power hierarchies and also creatively this manifests through these intertextual engagements. So yeah, these are all dimensions I found really exciting when it came to tackling gender in relation to these themes.
Thank you so much. And I hope for the audience, this does give you a sense of the flavor. I mean, there are all of these intersectionalities that are going on in every one of the essays. But in taking your point about sort of intercultural communication, one of the strengths also in the book is thinking about bodies and space and power, the power of the colony, some of the issues that Julia is just talking about. And in Faye's article in particular, but in Vladimir Kapoor's and several others, there's a real engagement with a tendency that goes beyond some of the recent scholarship that has come out about kind of homosociability. Christopher Reed, Christine Guth, Jean Poitvin have kind of talked about exotic locales or the reproduction in a Western context of these kind of fantasy settings as a way to work against non-normative expectations and a kind of a safe haven. But I really love the way that across the book, you're pushing these boundaries. And it's particularly apparent in Faye's text about the very strictly geographically controlled space of colonial Saigon. And then what happens in these decadent books. So I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about these kind of different bodies, intercultural communication, space, and the space colonial spaces.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. So just picking up from Julia mentioned something about gender, like women writers. And in my chapters, there's also Miriam Ari, so who's like a very cosmopolitan figure, very interesting figure. She was born in Jerusalem and then moved to Germany and then make her name in the Parisian circle. And one of her books is about Indochina. And it's about the Indo-Chinese femme fatale, actually. You talked about Salome. So this is like a reference to the cover of the book, our book as well. So in Indochina, the concubine is known as Gongai. And there's a whole vocabulary covering a sense, a new kind of words like Ongongeye. So Ongongeye as a verb, and also a person, a male figure who, a male settler who adopts a Gongai would be an Ongongeye as well, Ongongaiement as well. So a whole new neologism talking about this kind of appropriation of the land. But in Miriam Ari, what we can see is a sense, two ways of seeing Gongai. Gongai as a biblo, which is a very quintessential decadent hobby, and Gongai as a femme fatale, who kind of interrupts this domination, male domination. So we can read that, and that can be mapped into the physicality of Saigon as a French urbanized colonial capital in the East. So there's a sense. So I think across the book, what we see is different decadent capitals, and I talk about decadence-scape in my chapter as well, in which I kind of mapped kind of interracial transgressions onto the transgressions of borders in Saigon itself. So we can see, so across the book, we can see Indochina that Jenny mentioned in Sambuto as well, chapter on on the conquest of Indochina by a French soldier going there to basically steal a Buddha statue to take back to France to give to his lover. And there's a kind of intrigue about it. Very fascinating first chapter, actually, by Sambuto. There's China as well as what we kind of know through Octave Mirbeau, Le Jardin de Supplice. This chapter by Richard Hibbett, and also what Vladimir is here. So there's Africa as well. So there's a kind of colonial idea, colonial notions, colonial appropriation of by the writers in French Africa as well. And then there's of course the center, which is Paris, in Hélène and Aurélien chapter, and Persia by Julia, and India by Valerie. So this is a kind of the sense of the book, where by which we name French Decadence in a global context. So what we try to do is to decentering basically the idea of decadence as being urban and European, and or pan-European or pan-Atlantic. So between Paris, Europe, and America. So we can see that in the fin siècle, the decadence has traveled basically to other colonies, and there's a different kind of appropriations of decadence and anti-decadence. So Vladimir would be able to talk about the decadence and anti-decadence appropriation by these French colonial writers and settlers as well, maybe at the end. And also, in contrast to women writer, we can see that most of the writers are male, and we can see that they try at that period, they try to build a social and network, a flow of writers from the colonies, trying to decentralize also the French idea of literature alongside the French idea of nationalism. So there's a lot of chapters that touch on, the famous rise of nationalism and alongside colonization in this book as well. So I think that's about it for now.
Thank you. That's terrific. And I know that in Vladimir's chapter, he does talk about these kind of very similar homosocial La Grande France, this kind of clubs of men in the colonies replicating or spreading or recreating new spaces. So,
Elizabeth, if I may, I forgot to talk about homosexuality, because so I wanted to talk about the gender, the female writer, and then this kind of decadent scape and decadent capitals, and then the homosocial club, like men clubs basically. And one of the figure that a lot of scientific texts talk about is the figure of homosexuality. And we all know that the fin siècle is also the period where psychiatry and the medical discourse on sexuality and homosexuality was kind of invented, was started to be prevalent. So we talk about passer le brevet colonial, which means going into the colony and experience homosexuality. So so this is kind of extra literary discourse about homosexuality, but we rarely see homosexuality, literary homosexuality treated as homosexuality in literature. And one of the texts that I study is basically by Claude Farrer, the famous Les Civilisés, which won the Prix Goncourt in 1904-05, and that's a homosexual soldier, he's an engineer working in Indochina, and there's a contrast between what they call at that time congenital homosexuality, which is linked to European homosexuality as a kind of a choice of identity, and versus primitive homosexuality. And this primitive homosexuality is basically inscribed into the colonized body and also culture and identity. So instead of being a choice in Indochina for the Indo-Chinese, homosexuality is a kind of the race. It's mapped onto the race of Indo-Chinese men, and so there's this kind of thing that play in this text, and it's very interesting to see how homosexuality was talked about in a literary imagination through medical discourse as well, of pathology and atavism as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so I'm sure that the audience, feel free to ask questions in the chat for the discussion. I think these are all, we have a very short period of time, and one of the beauties of the volume is to throw out questions and use texts we don't necessarily read very often. Faye, you talked a little bit about the Sam Boodle's piece on the stolen Buddha, and I'd be curious to know a little bit more. One of the themes that runs across the book is religion, and that might be the attraction of something that is a different religion. So that might be, for example, it's a decadent trope, right? Because when Babé d'Aurevilly famously said, well, after Aobour, he has no choice but the pistol or the cross. And it will be the cross, that there's this sort of decadence in Catholicism, conversion to high ornamentation and multi-sensory experiences. But that also comes with the appropriation of other cultures' religious practices. And so it was very interesting to sort of think through anxieties about non-Christian religion in France and in the French colonies from people coming over, but also an intense infraction for an appropriation of, if that's Islam, that's Buddhism, but also then the stealing of religious artifacts that are put back into Europe. I can't remember, maybe could be in Vladimir Coupeau's, or it could be in Janai Engelhart Humphreys. Somebody talks about the French government as acting as an antiquities dealer. So I apologize to the contributor who said that, but it was quite an interesting idea, is this appropriation of religion, of cultural appropriation. And I don't know if anyone would like to speak a little bit more about either the religion or the appropriation of religious artifact.
I'll come in briefly on cultural appropriation more broadly rather than religion, because that quotation was from Dulafoy's travelogue. And it's not, and it's an interesting moment in the Dig Diary, because apart from this one passage, Dulafoy is keen to, associate himself with, I am part of his mission, I'm one of the boys, go French imperialism. And that is the one passage that is overtly critical, where it basically says, this mission, the people funding us, the French government, they don't care about understanding this ancient culture. All they care about is filling the Louvre. They're just thinking like an antiquities merchant. And what really struck me as fascinating about this particular appropriation, i.e. that of the ancient Susa artifacts, which are still in the Louvre today, if anyone wants to go and see them in the Antiquité Orientale, is that then this becomes associated with these ideas of regenerating France. So what Jenny was saying earlier, right? Colonialism as this kind of way of gaining more power. But you're looking at a past of a civilization that's not French, that's ancient Iran. And then it becomes about saying, well, we can learn from the energy and the colors and the style. We can, revivify our dulled aesthetics. Our race is weakened, but we can regenerate by channeling these great primitive ancient Persians, which is completely in contradiction with other passages where she says they're decadent. So this whole primitive or decadent question is there. But even once there was the subsequent Exposition Universelle in Paris, there were elements of the architecture of the hall that were copied from the Susa finds. And I know this is the kind of thing that Heidi Alexander also looks at. And also there was a maquette of the Susa finds and how they're exposed in the Louvre as part of the French displays. So to celebrate the greatness of France, they're showcasing these ancient Iranian artifacts. And so, yeah, I think that really struck me as a really surprising case of cultural appropriation there. But I don't know if Jennifer and Wanrug also wanted to come in on religion and other forms of appropriation.
On religion, I mean, I think it does vary very much depending on which religion. So there's a great anxiety about Buddhism as a kind of anti-religion, a non-religion, and I think Taoism as well. And one of the decadent writers that Wanrug worked on in her thesis is probably the most decadent of all is Albert de Pouvourville, who writes in this very lush kind of Oscar Wilde style, but he's pro-colonial. But so it's quite exciting writing in many ways, doing lots of different things. But he was also a Taoist. He converted. If that's probably not the right word, because it's seen as an anti-religion. And I think there's a bit of that with Buddhism as well. There's an anxiety about Buddhism as being le néant. So it's not like a rival religion, it's more like a negation of religion and a negation of willpower. So there's an anxiety about these Far Eastern religions contributing to decadence because they remove the will to live. They're seen as antithetical to that. Whereas I think Islam plays a very different role, and ancient religions as well. Islam, I think, in decadence is an amazing source of visual resources, this ornamentalism that I was talking about. And it's interesting though to think about the chapter on soumission, because obviously soumission is this, I don't know if anyone hasn't read it, I'm sure everyone's read it, but just in case you haven't, it's set in like very much now, it's far too topical, which is always the case of Welbeck novels, but the main character, François, allegorically named François, is an academic who works on French literature on Huysmans. So he's a specialist, and Welbeck does seem to know a surprising amount about Huysmans. So in a sense then that you're putting decadence in the front seat in this thinking about Islam in the most reactionary way possible. And I'm not one of the people who defend Welbeck as being ironic when he seems to be incredibly reactionary. So these anxieties about Islam now, about le grand remplacement and that whole Islamo-socialism or whatever it is, Islamo-gauchisme, all those buzzwords that the right reaction are using now in France, I think they're very much of our era and actually not so much present in the time of Huysmans. So there's not this real anxiety about Islam. I think Welbeck has brought that in all by himself. Well, he's tapped into that anxiety that is part of our own contemporary anxiety about decadence. So, different religions, different things. Sorry, Wanrug.
No, just Jenny, you can finish. Just to bridge between the two. So Jenny talk about anxiety and Julia talk about fascination towards like this kind of ancient civilization. So in Sam chapter, basically Buddhism kind of bridges the two. There's an anxiety towards this néant, because it's anti-religion, it's like, Jenny talk about it, but there's also fascination towards Buddhism as a kind of a new wisdom. And this is basically tied into what a French scholar called la Renaissance Indienne as well. So it's a kind of Buddhism coming from India, but then disappear from India and revived in Southeast Asia. So Indochina kind of play this role between anxiety and fascination. And so what you can see a lot in the trope of Buddha is the Buddha smile. This, basically linked to also the revival of Da Vinci, Mona Lisa smile, like in England and in France. So the Buddha smile have that kind of an enigmatic fascination and anxiety. And we can see the articulation of decadence and anti-decadence in the Buddha smile, basically, and the articulation, the kind of unsure which one, anti-decadence or decadence, kind of is a thread throughout the book as well. And this is in Jenny's chapter, she talked about this kind of, like an unsure position towards decadence as well. And basically in my research, Jenny mentioned, so I have in my book, the whole chapter on occultism and Buddhism and the archaeological, so the neon through religion and the neon through archaeology, particularly in Indochina, in relation to Buddhism, Taoism, and also in relation to the discovery of Angkor Wat in Cambodia as well. So that's the upcoming book, maybe next year.
We were joking that Facebook is divided into sex, drugs, and religion. And I have to say that the religion part inspired her less while she was writing it than the other two.
The rock and roll decadence, basically, which
Yeah.
we might expect from the fin siècle literature.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think I'm being mindful of the time, because I have so many more questions to ask you. And I think that the audience can see from this discussion how many issues, questions, complications are coming out of these texts written at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. And what I would do is, if any of the contributors are here and would like to chime in to any of the topics we've discussed, please feel free to raise your hand. And for everybody else, because we want you to have a chance to ask questions, please go ahead and ask questions in the chat or raise your hand, do the little hand raising icon, and we'll answer your questions. And I see Vladimir Kapoor. Would you like to say?
Hi, Vladimir.
Hello. Yeah, great to be here and hear all these wonderful contributions and discussions. So yes, I think yes, you've picked up on this idea of the homosocial in the chapter I was writing. I'm not a specialist in gender studies, queer studies at all. This is just something that kind of stood out when I was reading the writings by people like Pourville, and also Faye analyzed it very well in her PhD as well, some of those kind of representations. Now, what I found very interesting about this kind of grouping Français d'Asie is that they had a kind of a legitimate excuse to restrict membership because Académie Goncourt was close to women, right? And then all of a sudden, the moment that Judith Gauthier is admitted into the Académie Goncourt, she is admitted into the Français d'Asie, and they actually kind of use her influence to promote an author writing on Indochina, who was one of the first kind of prix féminin at the time, using Judith Gautier's influence. And so, it's Français d'Asie kind of could have said, well, we're just doing like everybody else, but said, we're doing this because this is an Asian custom. Une détermination tout asiatique de rester, demeurer entre hommes is what he writes about. Yeah, so no, I'm very thankful to Jenny and Faye and Julia for inviting me to contribute. So these are authors I'd written about, and I thought I had kind of, I was done with them basically because I was looking at it from a very different perspective. And then when this idea of decadence came up, I found it extremely productive actually to rethink some of those things I had written about, and it really threw a new light.
Yeah, that's true.
I think one of the great things about Vladimir's chapters is he looks at networks in relation to decadence, and so you can see how decadence is used by these people as a sort of, I wouldn't want to reduce it to a marketing tool, but it becomes like part of their group identity and a way of creating a network that reaches, across what were at the time very difficult, insurmountable distances between Paris and Saigon. And so it is part of this networking tool. It does become a whole group identity, doesn't it? And I think decadence is very like that. It's very much about creating a group identity and a cosmopolitanism. In general, it's studied in terms of cosmopolitanism between London and Paris, without thinking about the wider world, apart from a bit in Barcelona and maybe Belgium. So, that's really, you can actually see that on a broader scale. And I think Vladimir shows that very well. Can I mention, Elizabeth, something that's not in the volume?
Sure.
I was quite disappointed that we didn't manage to get anyone to write about post-colonial poetry and the influence on post-colonial poetry of fin de siècle poetry and Baudelaire a bit earlier. Because I think this is actually really, really important and something that is underexplored. And I think that there's a direct filiation, but there's also indirect filiations, perhaps through Glissant, people like that who are theorizing post-colonialism. So if anyone out there is looking for a topic, I think there's more work to be done there.
Yeah, that's interesting, because one of the questions I wanted to ask was genre. In fact, you have quite a variety of genres. The decadence goes into much more political writing than I would have expected. We're used to short stories and novels and poetry. And so if the audience doesn't have questions, I might ask you to talk a little bit about the kinds of genres. Did you find that in working with decadence in colonial in a colonial context or in a wider context, that there was more experimentation than might be going on in London or Paris. Or not.
Faye, did you want to?
I think it's kind of a covers. I think it's kind of covers more genres than we would have imagined. So in poetry in Indochina, there's a lot of poetry, and there's a very vibrant culture of publishing magazines and journals in Indochina, in Saigon and in Hanoi itself. And there's a lot of poetry with illustrations, and also a lot of short stories. So basically, when we talk about French decadence, we would, focus more on novels, but not short stories. So short story is a kind of a genre, like par excellence of decadence in the colonies. Don't ask me why, but it seems to be like that kind of a preference. And also travel writing. Maybe Jenny would jump into this one. Travel writing, you would be surprised how kind of how much decadent tropes and themes run through travel writings by all these French travelers as well. You wanted to write a chapter on travel writing,
yes, I had initially intended to write the introduction and a chapter on decadent travel writing, but the introduction grew to monstrous proportions and I didn't have time. So I was quite fascinated by that, because I tend to think of travel writing as being pragmatic and responding to a real outside world, and decadence as being particularly interested in something that's not real and is, much more fantaisiste, if you like. And yet I encountered travel writing where there are distinct decadent tropes and decadent style. And again, decadent style is a whole other issue, but this is an important thing in the writing of decadence. So there's famously Jean Lorrain, who's a very central figure in the decadent Parisian scene. He was a great traveler. He went to North Africa quite a lot, and he wrote up his travel writing. So there's he's part of, if you like, this. He's probably the most obvious one, but it's definitely a thing. So some of the tropes are, for example, the cliches that you associate with the Orient and with Orientalism. For example, the dance of the veils, where the woman unveils and then the mysterious Orient is revealed. But in Lorrain's version, this Mauresque in North Africa is doing this dance, and she's removing all these wonderful Oriental silks. And then at the end, what's revealed is underneath she has a Parisian corset, which is her kind of her proclaiming how modern she is, and she's had such trouble getting hold of it. But it's that anti-Orientalist or kind of belated Orientalism, and that the tongue-in-cheek twist at the end, I think, is very, very decadent. So the trope of belatedness as well, of arriving somewhere too late, when you're too late to see the authentic other, and it's all part of dwelling on corruption, and also relishing the corruption, not just seeing that it's not authentic, but actually enjoying the inauthenticity, which I think is perhaps how we ought to be traveling now, because we need to be looking for how cultures are mixing, and the authentic other's not there. So I think decadence has a lot to teach us.
I think in travel writing on Iran, it's a big thing. And it's so funny how you see authors, they're going to the same places around the same time, and the descriptions being completely different. So if it's Gobineau or Pierre Loti, then it's so decadent. I mean, Peugeot was great. No, it's not. And it's so fun. It makes me laugh, because with Loti, first he starts this from Espan, and he's like, oh, it's so gorgeous, it's beautiful, it's beautiful. Then, a few days later, he says, oh, tiles are falling off a facade. C'est lépreux, la façade léprosée. So, like decay, oh, gross. And then a few pages, no, even much later, towards the end of travel, he says, oh, I'll never forget seeing the city of Esfahan, and it's crumbling into dust, and it's just ruines dans le désert. I'm like, mate, it was a massive city. What are you talking about? It's just ruines dans le désert. And Gobineau, of course, has that kind of sense too. But then you'll read other travelers going around at the same time, and they'll just be talking about how it's a busy city or whatever else is happening there. So also that idea of decadence is very much a stylistic decision of what the author is going to emphasize about the place.
Can I add about genre? So basically, there's a kind of experimentation ongoing as well, but it's more in the aspirations. So all these authors would want to revive the French literature. So this is the idea of anti-decadence, so reviving the energy, l'énergie de la nation, through kind of reinventing themes and images, decadent themes and decadent images. So you can see that this kind of exotic images and imagery would be incorporated into this vast global imagery of decadence. And they would, what they do quite in a quite deliberate way is to basically to revive French literature. So I think in Vladimir's chapter, the writers talked a lot about this kind of, you know, at the end, it's this network. It's just not to self-promote themselves. Maybe you correct me or comment on that, but also basically to attack the heart of attack the heart of French nation through literature, through reinventing literature. So there's that kind of aspiration coming from decadence, basically, that idea, that kind of experimentation. But I would say it's in the themes more than in the style. Well, in the style, you could argue that they would incorporate native ways of seeing the world, of talking about the world. Because for example, in Albert de Pourvouville, it's not in this book that we editing. But in my project, he would reinvent the idea of the nation of the Red King, so which is like a statue in Angkor Wat, which fascinated a lot of French travelers. And through this idea of basically reinventing anew, back to the origin, that kind of comes with the notions of decadence as well. So. Don't know. Yeah.
If I may just chip in, I think what's quite interesting about this question of genre is that there are various ways of doing it. Both the anti-decadents and the decadents are thinking of themselves as kind of reinvigorating French literature. And one of the things that comes up with this kind of anti-decadent circle is the impossibility of writing kind of a naturalist social novel set in the colonies. Marius Harry-Leblanc, they're kind of exasperated at the reception of their books because people are just kind of expecting something else from them. And in a way, it shows also the links between kind of national culture and genre, as if saying, you can't write a Zola-like novel and set it in La Réunion. It doesn't work. And they're very disappointed at that, actually. So
jumping onto Vladimir's point, conversely, Judith Gauthier is very popular because novels like La Conquête du Paradis, Valérie Descosses, or Iskander, Histoire Persane, that I look at in my own work, it's genre experimentation because she's imitating epic poems from Sanskrit tradition or medieval Persian tradition. And it's a different blend of fairy tale and realism and epic narrative that readers aren't used to. But it goes back to what you're saying, Vladimir. It's like, oh, well, writing about Asia elsewhere, but it's in a different, more sort of exciting, it's not a realist style, there's a different genre going on. And maybe that made it more palatable than going for a realist style like you were describing.
Yeah, I mean, on the other hand, someone like Pourvouville, he writes in a style that, in some ways it resembles kind of Segalen, with this trying to incorporate kind of the native point of view, but it didn't sell well. That was really kind of restricted to quite an avant-garde audience, I think, and it's clear it wasn't meant for the kind of the popular market, to édition populaire or anything like that.
Yeah. There's a kind of element of tales, and in these kind of colonial decadence as well, a lot of tales, because they try to imitate the native indigenous kind of fairy tales and stories. So that kind of tied into the experimentation that they try to reinvigorate the literature. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. We talked about Bénédicte Monica's work earlier on children's literature as well. Right. And so this is the same time there's the rise of children's literature, Judith Gauthier doing historical novels and fairy tales based on, that makes a lot of sense. So I can't believe we've gotten to 3 o'clock and we're still going. We could keep going, but I don't want to keep our panelists any longer. You've been so generous to produce this beautiful book that raises important questions about the past, about what literature does, how literature gets into the nooks and crannies of the colonial project and really kind of exposes it from the inside, where it either work on, it shows readers at the time, and it shows us now some of the issues that were going on. So I hope we can give all 4 of you and then the other 8 contributors a round of applause, and I hope that you'll read the book, use it with your students. And I think we'll stick around for a few minutes if anybody just wants to socialize, ask questions in a non-public venue, but thank you so much.